Chapter 4. The Green Apparition. As the sailboat moved up the lake, Nancy relaxed. It was a beautiful day, and the water was calm. There was just enough breeze to carry the craft along at moderate speed. The girls had a close look at Kingfisher Tower and Council Rock, famous in the Indian history of Otsego. At the head of this 9-mile-long lake, said Nancy, pointing ahead, is Mount Wellington, but it's never called that. Instead, the mountain is known as Sleeping Lion because of its shape. And it certainly looks like one, George observed. Nancy explained. I've been reading up on the history of this place. Did you know that the village was founded by William Cooper, father of James Fenimore Cooper? He later became a judge. There's an amusing story told in connection with his wife. He loved the wilderness, and when a young man, he decided to move his family from Burlington, New Jersey, up to Cooperstown. She refused and would not budge from her favorite chair. Not to be outwitted, Cooper had his wife and the chair lifted bodily into a covered wagon and brought to her new home. George laughed heartily. I'll bet she loved that. If my husband ever dared to do that to me, I wouldn't speak to him for a month. I'll remind your friend Bert, Nancy teased. George grimaced, then said, Here's a local story I heard. There was a man named Provost who lived along the east shore of this lake. He wrote to a friend, saying all his children had whooping cough at once. Ordinarily, this might not seem like anything unusual, but as it happened, Mr. Provost had 21 children. It was Nancy's turn to laugh. By this time, the girls were nearing the bay. Suddenly, both of them noticed 2 boys in a canoe. They were clawing furiously at the water to reach the paddles which evidently had been swept from their craft. Their efforts seemed futile, so Nancy suggested to George that they help the little fellows. I'll come about, she said, and slacken the sheet rope. George worked the tiller. By expert tacking, the girls came alongside the drifting paddles and scooped them up. The boys were waiting with outstretched hands. That's great, one of the little fellows exclaimed. Gee, thanks a lot. George grinned. You boys are really good at dog paddling, she remarked. Yeah, but pretty soon your arms ache, the other boy said. Nancy asked them if they ever went up into the woods on the mountain. Sure, said one lad, who told them his name was Chuck. Have you ever seen a strange man up there? Nancy queried. No, Chuck answered, but we've heard funny sounds. Nancy asked what they were like. Something like the whirring of machinery. You know, soft buzzing. You have no idea what it was from? The boys looked at each other. Maybe we shouldn't tell you, but we got scared and ran away, Chuck confessed. Nancy smiled, saying she did not blame them. Then she asked, Have you ever seen a woman gliding across the water near here? Both boys giggled, and Chuck said, You must be kidding. The children thanked the girls again for retrieving the paddles and started off. Nancy and George pulled into the dock of Mirror Bay Bide-a-Wee a few minutes later. Aunt Eloise and Bess were waiting for them. The crestwood is great, Nancy told her aunt. What a wonderful surprise for us. Then she spoke of Yo's strange smile and tried to guess why. Aunt Eloise said that Yo seemed a little hard to figure out. If you'd given him the chance, he might have told you some tall story about the crestwood. Bess announced that she was hot from her trip to the village and wanted to go for a swim. How about the rest of you? She asked. Everyone was willing, and within minutes they were ready. Nancy proposed that they do a little diving to see if they could find out what the woman gliding on the water might have been looking for. I'm sure she was searching for something because she kept her head down and turned it from side to side. The girls separated and went underwater time after time. The bay was so clear they could see as deep as the sun filtered. They tried scratching the silt and loose shale, but found nothing of interest. In a little while, however, George came to the surface. "I've discovered something," she exclaimed, and led the way down to a sunken rowboat. It took the combined efforts of them all during the short periods when they could hold their breath to turn the rowboat over and finally bring it to the surface. "It still floats," George remarked. "Do you suppose this is what the woman was looking for?" Nancy shrugged as they beached the rowboat. "In any case, let's examine it." Both lockers were opened, but contained only an assortment of old rags. Nothing was wedged under the slatted floorboards. "If there was ever anything hidden in this old wreck," said George, "it has long since floated away or been taken." Nancy agreed. "Let's leave it on the shore so the woman can have a chance to look at it." Bess spoke up. "You keep referring to that mysterious figure as if she were a real person. I think it's just some funny way the mist rolls in here that makes it look like a woman." Nancy said nothing, but she was convinced a live person was involved. The group was very hungry, and all helped prepare the evening meal. An hour later, they began to eat. "This baked chicken is scrumptious," George complimented Nancy. "You're some cook." "But it won't match Bess's dessert," she replied, winking at her friend. Broad smiles crossed their faces when Bess later came from the kitchen and set down the delectable dish. Atop the thickly frosted chocolate roll were huge walnuts. The first slice was passed to Aunt Eloise. After tasting it, she announced with a smile, "It's good, but I prefer my walnuts dipped in chocolate rather than pickled." "Pickled walnuts?" Bess asked incredulously. Miss Drew nodded. "You got these from a jar I bought in the village. The pickling is based on a colonial recipe. Back in those days, preserves and pickles were often made from such foods as green walnuts, barberries, parsley, even nasturtium buds." After the first bite, the diners got used to the unusual taste. As Bess was directing her attention to a second slice of cake, George cast an annoyed glance at her cousin. "Pretty soon you'll look like a sweet roll," the slim girl quipped. "That's not fair, George Fane," her cousin returned. Aunt Eloise and Nancy glanced at each other and decided it was time to change the subject. As the girls finished tidying the kitchen, Nancy said, "Who's game to hike up the mountain and try to prove or disprove the stories of the green sorcerer?" George was eager to go, but Bess was not keen about it. "How about you, Aunt Eloise?" Nancy asked. Miss Drew smiled. "I wouldn't think of letting you go alone, and besides, I'm interested in seeing what's up there. Let's all make the climb." Each carried a flashlight, but did not use it at once since it was not yet dusk. The foursome had been climbing for about 10 minutes when they heard footsteps. Presently, a man came toward them. He was dressed in woodsman's clothes and carried a small bag like those used for tools. "Good evening," he said pleasantly. Then he added, "Isn't it kind of late for you ladies to be climbing the mountain? There are many holes along this so-called trail. You're lucky you didn't turn an ankle on your way up." Aunt Eloise said, "I'm sure we'll be perfectly all right. We'll be careful." The man frowned. He was rather short but had an athletic build and looked very strong. "I beg you not to go any farther in the dark. It's too dangerous. I'll be glad to help you down the mountain." Nancy thanked him for his solicitousness, but said they would like to go a little farther. She was tempted to ask him if he had ever seen the Green Man, yet instinct told her not to. Without another word, the man went on down the mountain trail. Aunt Eloise and the girls climbed upward. Suddenly the woods began to sparkle with infinitesimal lights. "Fireflies!" Nancy exclaimed. "When we get back, let's gather some in a jar and watch the little insects turn their lights off and on." The trekkers had gone only a short distance when suddenly they heard a shrill whistle like those used by the police. "What's that for?" George asked. "Perhaps it was some kind of a signal," Nancy replied. "The sound seemed to come from below, so maybe the man who passed us blew it to warn some friends who are up here." Bess looked very unhappy. "I'm sure we're headed for trouble," she insisted. "Please, let's go back to the cabin." But she was the only one who wanted to stop the hunt. Contrary to what the man had said, Aunt Eloise and the girls had found no holes. With the glow from their flashlights and the many fireflies, they were able to detect rough spots. Bess became more and more nervous. "I just know there's danger ahead. Maybe it's only intuition, but I think we should give up." Nancy had another idea. "If there are people on the mountain carrying on some illegal operation," she said, "they've certainly been forewarned of the approach of strangers." She suggested that they turn off their flashlights and stop talking. "Let's hide behind trees." 5 minutes later, the strange apparition of the green man appeared a little distance ahead. He was swathed in a weird, flickering light, and his face had an eerie greenish hue. "Oh!" Bess cried out involuntarily. At that moment, a deep, sonorous voice began to speak. Was it coming from the green man or from someone else nearby?
"I am the sorcerer,"
the voice said.
"Return to your cabin at once. Trouble there."
End of chapter 4.